Dole Student Advisory Board. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending this afternoon's presentation. The Student Advisory Board is composed of KU students committed to the work of the Dole Institute. We attend regular meetings, assist in events like this, and plan SAB-sponsored programs every semester. Members of the SAB receive a great opportunity to network with our special guests, and if you are a student and would like to join, please contact the Dole Institute. At the Dole Institute, we would like to hear from you. If you enjoy tonight's program, please let us know by contacting us on Facebook, through Twitter, or through our email listed on the website. If you prefer to write us a note, note cards and pens will be available on the front table as you leave the building. Before we begin this afternoon, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones, and after the interview, we have some time for a few brief questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and a student helper will bring a microphone to you. Please ask just one question. And now I'd like to introduce you to the director of the Institute, Bill Lacey.
Thank you very much, Kristen. Thanks to all of you for coming out on a gorgeous day to learn about a very important problem that the world is trying to deal with. When we heard from our good friend Aisha at the Muslim Student Association that they wanted to do this program, we were very excited because we didn't have anything scheduled. And we did do a program last week with Andy Carvin of NPR on Arab Spring and social media. Hopefully some of you made that. But today's program was a perfect addition. I've also had the chance during the process of setting this meeting up of meeting a very interesting gentleman who I'm going to introduce to you. He represents the Center for Cultural and Educational Exchange, which is, along with the Muslim Student Organization, Student Association, is a co-sponsor of today's program. So we're very, very happy that you could take the time to come out. Would encourage you to look at the back of the program to see all of our other upcoming programs before the end of the semester. And I would like to introduce the gentleman who really made today happen, and we are most appreciative to him for all of his hard work, Bassam Halani. Bassam?
Hello, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, most merciful, most compassionate. My name is Bassam Halani. I'm from the Center for Cultural and Educational Exchange. It's a nonprofit organization that is based here in Lawrence that deals with cultural dialogue and better understanding between the various cultures that we host in our beautiful city here. When Aisha told me that the Dole Institute are holding or want to hold an event about Syria, I was very sad, I'll be honest with you. I was sad because I wanted to hold this meeting to tell you about the beautiful side of Syria, how it is the cradle of civilization, how compassionate the people are, how diverse the people are. In the outskirts of Damascus, there's a town called Ma'lula, which they speak Aramaic till today. It's the language of Jesus Christ. I want to have an event telling you about the diversity and the accomplishment of Syrians. But today, sadly, we are here talking about ceasefire. We're talking about human rights violation. We're talking about refugees, camps. This is very saddening to all of us Syrians and to all the humanity at large, because what's happening is really sad over there. And who is the better person, really, to shed some light on what's going on here and to provide some answers better than Dr. Radwan Ziadeh. I had the privilege to meeting with him earlier today. I learned that he's a dentist by profession, but because of the need of so much civil and political activities, we all pulled into this. We have no previous training of political work. We have no previous training in humanitarian work. We just faced with this difficult situation, and we're doing the best that we can. Dr. Ziadeh is a senior fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C. He's also a fellow at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, also in Washington, D.C. I'm very happy to introduce you to Dr. Ziadeh, and after his presentation, I'll be more than happy to take question and answers. We also have a very handsome young man here by the name of Hani Sawaf. He's a Syrian student here at the medical pre-med, and he'll be also very happy to take some questions if you have anything about the point of view of student who are from Syria and who were there, and if you have any question regarding that experience. I'm very thankful for the Dole Institute for hosting this event. I'm very thankful for the various Islamic organizations here in town, the Muslim Student Association and KU Law Muslim Association. They're also sponsoring this. So without further delay, I would introduce you to Dr. Radwan Ziadeh.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for the Dole Institution for Politics for the invitation. Despite all of that, we have to speak about the positive side of the Syrian people, because I just published an op-ed how the Assad regime trying to change the face of the struggle right now from Syria, being a peaceful revolution to have a dignity and a human rights for the Syrian people, until being armed conflict between two sides or two parties, which two parts they have. This is another case. What's happened in Syria, exactly like what's happened in Tunisia and Egypt as a part of the Arab Spring. The people being inspired by what's going on in Tunisia and Egypt, and some school children in the southern city of Daraa. They wrote some graffiti on the schools walls at that time. The slogan has been used as "Sha'b yurid isqat al-nizam," the people, they wanted to topple the regime, as a slogan to empower the people that they need to an end of the regime. This slogan taken from a very famous Tunisian poet, which died at 27 years old, and now became the symphony or became the slogan of all these Arab revolutions. When and the response of the Assad security forces, they arrest these 14 years old children, and they put them in prison and torture them. They remove their nails. Until now, one of them still missing. The families of these children decided to go to the head of the security forces, asking him to release the children. He is the cousin of the current President Bashar al-Assad. He refused, and he said to the families that I sent them to the headquarters and go back to your wives and bring other children. And if you cannot do that, bring your wives to us, and we can do that. This is such of humiliation language always been used in the security forces in Syria. And then the families decided next day on March 18 to march toward the headquarters of the security forces, asking for the accountability of the head and asking for releasing all of these children. The government responded again by using live ammunition, and 8 has been died in March 18. Within few hours, the demonstration spread to all over the country, in Latakia in the north, in the coast, and in Banias, in Homs, and other cities, under, of course, the influence about what's going on in Yemen and Egypt at that time, and in Libya. Unfortunately, the government continued to use the live ammunition, and maybe making much worse regarding turning out to the areas that they have had spot like Daraa, Banias, and Homs to arrest everyone there. They turned out all the schools to be detention centers. The estimate number of the people who are in prison is more than 50,000. We do believe the number is much higher. As example, I have 5 in my family, one of them my brother, who's been detained for almost three months. There is no enough space in the prisons, and they put him in the garage of the military airport in Al-Mazza. He lived there for almost only half a piece of bread, because they cannot afford to feed all of those prisoners, and still have 3 of my cousins, 1 of my uncles. One of them, he is 14 years old. By chance, he was just walking in a street, and there was a demonstration, and they arrest each one there. He's missing, and we have no information about his right now. This, you can imagine, this is one family. They have 5 persons. This is it's the number. Is the people who are. It's reminder us what's happening, of course, in the Nazi regime before, where they are arresting each one above 15 years old and put them in prison. With the same time, it became the other issue about displacement. It became a humanitarian crisis because, as the estimate number of the UN, more than 1 million has been enforced to leave their homes, apartments, to displaced inside Syria. 80% of the inhabitants of Homs, they've been enforced to leave their homes and apartments. And more, of course, 40,000 in Turkey, Lebanon, in Jordan. It became a humanitarian disaster by the Assad continue of the killings and shelling on different cities in Syria, basically in Homs, Daraa. The response of the international community, it wasn't as the Syrian expected, because we have before that in Libya when decided the people to speak up against the Gaddafi regime, the international community and the Security Council acted very quickly. After 11 days, the Security Council adopted Resolution 1970, which put sanctions on al-Gaddafi and referred the crimes against humanity to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. The Gaddafi continued the killings. The Security Council met again and adopted Resolution 1973, which allowed for protecting the civilians under all the necessary measures, which allowed the NATO to start the operation, and they ended up with the Gaddafi regime. In Syria, it has been 14 months, and the Security Council was unable even that to condemn the violence has been taken by the Assad regime. Just adopt 3 days ago, the first resolution, 2042, about the situation in Syria, which called about ceasefire. The Assad killed more than 12,000 and enforced 1 million to display their homes, and 50,000 has been political prisoners. And the Security Council was unable because the Russian is backing and the Chinese backing the Assad regime with that to protect the Assad regime from getting any condemnation. And the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva met for the first time in its history 4 times regarding the situation in Syria. The first time in April 2011, in August, where the number of the people who have been killed in April was 600, then 2,400. Then they met again in December, where the number raised to be 6,000. Then they just have special session on March, where the number exceed 9,000. I said in my testimony at the UN Human Rights Council, this is not the function of the UN institutions to account the people, how many people have been killed. Our responsibility to stop the killings. Our responsibility to protect the civilians, not to account how many people have been killed. Even that, the UN Human Rights Council, in its resolution, mentioned that what's happening in Syria, crimes against humanity, until now, the Hague or the International Criminal Court cannot open investigations about all these crimes. And the people, they feel that the international community abandoned them. They live, this is why they repeat every time, Ya Allah ma'alna ghairak, oh God, we don't have anyone help us. And this became a tragedy not only for the Syrians who are living inside Syria, but also for us, for Syrians who are living outside, who cannot do anything to help our brothers or our mothers, sisters who are living in Syria. What the international community should do. The Security Council agreed on the resolution 2042 to send monitors, to send 30 unarmed monitors to Syria. That's happened before in different countries. And Syria itself has what's called the Arab monitors, but it was totally failed, because those monitors and experience, of course, the Assad regime playing on time, buying time, sending them to different areas, and it wasn't able, this mission, to stop the killings, which became the priority of the Syrians right now. And this is why many questions mark about what the international mission of international blue hat can achieve if still the killings continue. We have now 3 days. Today at least 57 have been killed. 37 itself in Homs. And it's clear that the Assad will not respect the resolution 1942 and will not stop the killings. This is why the responsibility of the international community and the Security Council to adopt much more stronger resolution under Charter 7, not Charter 6, which can allow to take necessary measures to protect the civilians. If the Security Council failed to do that, and this is the high possibility for the position of Russia and China, I think that the United States and Europe and the Arab allies, along with Turkey, they should to move beyond the Security Council. It has been before in Bosnia in 1994, which the same people who are serving in the administration today, they served in the Clinton administration in the 90s. And they should learn the lessons, that if we acted before, we save more lives. If we acted before, maybe more lives had been saved. And this is always Clinton has been repeated that he's the only regret that he has in his administration that he cannot act to save more lives in Rwanda and in Bosnia. And this is, it's the same situation right now. I think this is why the international community and the United States, if the Security Council failed to act, they should move to beyond the Security Council, as what's happened in the Koreas in the 50s, as what's happened in Bosnia in 1995, and in Kosovo. This is the responsibility of the international community to protect the civilians. Under the responsibility to protect 2005 UN summit, it stated that when states, they have policy toward its own citizens to commit crimes against humanity or genocide or war crimes, then the responsibility of the international community to act and to intervene to prevent such crimes against humanity to continue to be committed by such state. This is why this is just a brief description about the situation in Syria, and I will be more than happy to answer any questions if you have. Thank you very much. Do you think that the opposition forces in Bosnia was organized? It's always that's been repeated by the United States and other countries as excuse. Let me recall the excuses in Libya. Of course, this administration did not act in Libya. It's been pulled out by France and UK. It was the excuses here that Libya is very huge country and it needs a huge to enable the defense system of Al-Qaddafi regime at that time. They used here the opposite excuse. They said that Syria is different than in Libya. You have money. It's more civilian and populated in the area. I don't think that there is the lack of political will in the United States to do the specific actions to help the Syrians right now. It's not because the opposition is not united. And by the way, it's not an easy to have a very united opposition after 40 years. Look to the Republicans and Democrats here. Do they have a unified agenda on the healthcare? This is one of the established democracies in the world. And one of the problems in Syria that we haven't been, we cannot even that we have a sitting like this. You have to get a permission from the security will never get such permission. I run a human rights organization in Syria called Damascus Center for Human Rights Studies. We do some trainings in private homes, and we do some training in churches or in mosques. It's because even that we have only 15 students about some basic human rights concept. This is why this is one of the problems, that the opposition has to have a place to debate, to discuss, to be close to each other, to have a unified agenda. Also, the opposition succeeded to establish the Syrian National Council, which I am a member in. The Syrian National Council, it's a coalition of different political parties, which include all the major political parties and major social movements in Syria who played a very critical role right now in initiating the protest in Syria, and each one included in the SNC. But the SNC is not seen as a very solid, strong organization because of the lack of support from international community. Like what's happening in Libya, as example, the TNC, Transitional Libyan Council, has been recognized a month after month of the announcement. And this is one of the problems. At the end, I see that the excuse of having united opposition, this has never been the case in other areas where the international community helped to intervene to prevent the civil war or to prevent crimes against humanity. It's always been used as excuse.
Why do you think they are not doing anything?
I think for different reasons. What's the administration telling us that this is an election year and will be very difficult for the United States to intervene. Secondly, they don't have a clear map exactly how the Assad or this crisis will end. Because the demands of the Syrian opposition, no one asking for troops on the ground. It's the operation in Libya was very successful, and no one asked for troops on the ground. And this is the same in Syria. No one asked for troops on the ground. But what we're asking exactly to implement the safe zone between the Turkish and the Syrian borders. And the United States implemented that very successfully in Kurdistan in Iraq in 1991. It was, at that time, there is Security Council Resolution 866. They over-interrupted the resolution. It wasn't stated about safe zone, but the United States over-interrupted and implemented the safe zone along with its allies. This is why it's now having safe zone will save more lives in Syria, along with the Turkish-Syrian borders, inside the Syrian territories. And that's required to have a no-fly zone above the designated area. This will show the Assad regime a sign about how the international community is serious to intervene to protect the civilians in Syria. What the Assad regime believes right now, that he can kill whatever, the international community will not intervene militarily, then no one we can touch. Those diplomacy, those appeals, I can deal with them later on when I will be able to kill each one and to stop the uprising. And this is why the strategy of the Assad regime don't care about all these condemnation resolutions. You have to focus on the ground, to kill as much, to silence the people, sentence them, and do whatever you want like to do. As soon there is no military intervention from outside who can challenge, because still the Assad regime, despite of what's called the rise of the Free Syrian Army, who the army or the officers who have defected from the Syrian army hold the strongest power. You have one of the largest army in the Middle East, more than 400,000 soldiers and officers. And even that's, let's say 40,000, the Free Syrian Army, but still hold one of the largest army. At the same time, still that the security forces and the elite units within the army is very loyal to him, and they can fight to him at the end until there is no clear sign from the international community can to intervene to change the balance between the two parties.
Hold on, wait for the microphone. I'm sure your question is on the video. Thank you.
How do you see the larger movement playing out, the Arab Spring movement?
We have to put in our mind three key players in each country. The Arab Spring, it was a wave of democratization. We have been seen before in Eastern Europe in the 80s, in 89. We have seen before that in Latin America. It was very late for the Arab to come, but to come, much better to come late, never to come. And that's when you have the wave of democratization started from Tunisia, and each country has different categories. But in all the 5 countries who have right now revolutions, and in the region they would like to have it, the world revolution, they don't like the war, the awakening, or the Arab Spring, because they do believe that they made a lot of sacrifices to change the status quo of the dictators who's been supported by the West. Look to the Mubarak, Zain al-Abidin, and all these dictators has been supported by the United States and big allies for the United States. What they did, we have, it's unpopular, popular uprising, is leaderless. No one of the political parties can claim that he's leading the uprising or leading the revolution. Secondly, the role of the army. The role of the army is really important and crucial, because in Tunisia it sided with the revolution, did not open the fire on the protesters, and when the uprising ended, he did not intervene in the transition process. This is why Tunisia, they have the most successful transitional period. It's the opposite of what's happening in Egypt, where the army decided to intervene to hold the power and to govern and to the transition. This is why it's many questions raised now about the intention of the army to stay in power or how to hold the political process. In Yemen and in Libya, the arms split. But in Libya, you have international intervention which help. In Syria, the most worst scenario, where the army sided with the regime and opened fire. Those photos, which never seen in other countries, where you have the tanks, they entering in each city and each village. Sorry. Entering each city and each village, killing the civilian neighborhoods, and killing whatever without any feeling of accountability, of responsibility about the role of the army protecting the people, not defending the regime. And this is why I think Syria will be much more complicated and much more difficult in the transition. The third role about the international community, I think the role of the international community is very important. The United States has a great relationship with Egypt. They use that most of the army officers trained in the United States. And they use this leverage. And they used this leverage to convince Mubarak to step aside, to avoid any consequences or any conflicts in Egypt. And this is why should the international community and the United States continue to follow up in the matters. Look what's happening in Libya as example. After the operation ended in Libya, there is a huge responsibility of the international community to help the Libyans, because you have the demilitarization as one priority, then to train the security and the police to train them to be how to deal with the people from human rights perspective. But the international community abandoned Libya. I met the Libyan Prime Minister Mahmoud Jibril in Brussels last month, and he was complaining how the international community is not answering even their questions or requests to help them, because the transition, it's not an easy period. This is the easy, we can decide the country to be on the right side or the wrong side.
Syria's wider strategic role in the region. Every other revolution so far hasn't stood the chance of maybe realigning kind of the power balance in the region, whereas Syria may have more of a role in that. If you could speak to that a bit.
I think that Saddam Hussein in the Gulf War, the second Gulf War, he called it that battle as the mother of the battles. And now the Arab commentators, they call the Syrian revolutions and the mother of the revolutions. Because this revolution will change the whole strategy of the great Middle East. Syria has long relationship with Iran. And now when the Assad regime will fall, Iran will lose the Arab gate, which use this gate to get an access to the Palestinian issue, to the Lebanon, through Hezbollah. And this will be the access between Hezbollah, Iran, Iraq, and Iran will cut, and now we have such an access. This will be, of course, major shift and major change in the region. The second issue, the role of Syria and Lebanon. In the last 30 years, Syria played a very negative role in Lebanon, occupying Lebanon, sometimes by force, other times through the security and through mukhabarat. And this is why now when you have a new page in the Syrian history, or will open a new page between the two nations, the Syrians and Lebanese. And that's other great change in the whole Middle East. The third change will be the relationship with the West. The Assad regime, when the West to hold the authoritarian power, and we know, look how the always explanation how the authoritarian can survive. As you make the country far away from interrogation, from the international community in economy, in education, in politics, high possibility to survive. Look what's happening in North Korea, where none of the countries have any leverage to North Korea. And the only Chinese authoritarian regime the same with North Korea. And the Assad regimes in the last 40 years tried to keep Syria very isolated. We don't have internet until 2001. We don't have fax until 1998. And until now, you cannot change money. The only two countries in the Middle East you cannot use a credit card, only Syria and Sudan, because of the sanctions. And then when you are isolated the regime economically, education, and from any agreements from the international community, then the international community or none of the countries have any leverage to influence you or to change your politics. And this is exactly what's happened. Now, with the fall of the Assad regime, the Syrian, which they have major success outside of Syria, they have the opportunity now to build their Syria again. We put a vision to Syria to be on 2040 as a progressive state, according to different indications. The first, according to of the GDP, and according to indication of the good governance, the corruption, the rule of law, and all of these issues. And we are very proud of the Syrians who make Syria outside they have very successful stories. And we can make these successful stories inside Syria when you open the system when you make the chances for each one to contribute to its own country. And we are very believe in that, but we right now all our focus how to end the Assad regime and to build a new Syria.
Sir, on the wider strategic implication in the region, according to a Lebanese general that I recently interviewed for a book I'm now writing, he said because the West is not getting more proactively involved, what we're doing is we're giving more fodder to Hezbollah, because Hezbollah is finding an easy connection with the regime, and they're just growing, according to this general. What do you say to that?
It's right now we have. It's like the Cold War. Look to the fight in the Security Council between the Russians and the West. It's and the Syrians who are the victims. I think because the United States under the Obama administration, they come up with a policy called leading from behind, because they said too much complicated and we don't need to go to the details. That's allowed for the Russians to read from the front. We never, in very rare cases, see the Chinese representative in the UN speaking on behalf of one of the issues. Now we see the Russians, they are speaking every day. How that's the opposition committed mistakes and how the Assad regime, and they backing from the secret channels, the Assad regime through money, through guns, along with the Iranians. This is why Syria became a strategic point for, I think, the international politics, about how it's ended with Syria, that evaluate the Russian role and the Chinese role in the Security Council. Look, the Chinese, they never been practice veto only in their own garden, like Burma or other areas in India or other areas where they have very strategic special interest. But what they don't have interest in Syria. But they saw right now that the United States is not practicing as a superpower as supposed to be. And this is why they're filling the vacuum by exercising their power. And they are sure that the United States now it cannot do more on these issues. And I think this is one of the issues which strikes me a lot, how to see the Russian and the Chinese acting on Syria, which they don't have strategic interest there. But they benefit from the vacuum that the United States and the Europeans, they lifted for domestic issues. The United States, they have election, the France, they have election. With the same time, for first time ever, you have the Arab League, which very authoritarian regional institution, but they come up with a very strong position on Libya, and they come up with a strong position on Syria. For the first time ever, the position of the Arab League is much more advanced on the position of the United States. The Arab League, they called in last December for the U.S. for peacekeeping troops under the UN or on the Arab League. The United States at that time, did not back the resolution. They said, we don't have even that peace to have peacekeeping troops. And that's make the Arabs upset about the role of the United States. And many of the Syrians believe that maybe now, if you need to solve the Syrian crisis, you have to go to Moscow, not to Washington.
You were talking about the Arab League observers that were sent back in December and how it was basically a failure. How do you feel about the new observer mission sent by the UN? Are you optimistic about that? Do you think it will help Syria go in the right direction?
I think at the end, the international community knows that the observers mission will not achieve anything. Because why you are sending observers to know who's the firing come from? But you have how many resolutions from the UN Human Rights Council about crimes against humanity? How many reports from Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch? This is very well documented. Why you are sending observers right now? And you know that the Assad response will not implement or accept the mission of the observers. This is back to the will of the international community to do the right actions in right time to help the Syrians. Of course, a huge difference between the Arab monitors and the UN, because the Arab, they don't have enough experience before, and it was a total mess. They went to the areas like Homs and Idlib, even that they don't have pens or on cameras. They borrow the cameras from the population to take photos about the violations. It was total mess, and the report, the chief of the mission at Dabi, which the worst human rights observers in the world, who has committed crimes against humanity in Darfur, to send him to Syria, it was a very significant sign how it's the Arab League, they're doing their job. Now the UN is different, of course, but with the same time, look to the number. The international community sent 7,000 observers to Kosovo. Now they're sending only 30. They can cover only one neighborhood in Baba Amr and Homs. In Syria enlarged, and the number of the demonstrations, the number of the hotspots, they need at least 5,000. This is why that creates a lot of question mark, why the international community is playing, why they sending this only 30, and now only in 6. In Syria, we don't know when the 24 will arrive.
How do you feel about arming the opposition or sending arms into the opposition?
It's not enough. And when you're arming the opposition, you are accelerating the civil war. You don't have one single.
So you're against it?
No, you don't have one single example in history that's arming the opposition will be able to topple regime. Only one case of Sierra Leone, where you have very weak central government. Then arming the opposition is not enough without international intervention to change the balance. Because the opposition, the Free Syrian Army, will not be able to change. This is the challenge we have. You cannot challenge the tanks and the troops. You have very advanced weapons, and this is something you don't have. But this is the challenge. When we say that to the Europeans and the Americans, they said, you are right. But we said that you have to arm the opposition with the same time making some actions militarily. You cannot do one of them and criticizing the other nations who are doing only arming the opposition. This is important. We understand that arming the opposition will get Syria to the path in the civil war. But with the same time, the people, they have the right to take arms to defend themselves. Because when you see Shabiha, those death squads, or the thugs who are into your apartment, killing your wife, your daughter, you have to defend yourself in any way. And this is what's happened exactly. This is why we need more from the international community, not only arming the opposition, but to take necessary actions by implementing the safe zone, a limited no-fly zone above designated area, with the same time some airstrikes.
how intermingled are the dozens or so confessionary and ethnic groups in Syria? Assad seemed to be merciless, but targeting rather defined neighborhoods. Now, this is would be one of the problem probably in no-fly zone, you know, how intermingled they are, because there are really more than a dozen confessionary groups in Syria, and which makes monitors too, the problem of monitors much more difficult, although I'm not excusing the United Nations. I'm not saying anything about
you have actually in the northern part of Syria, in the province of Idlib, you have de facto safe zone. In the northern part of Syria, the province of Idlib, you have de facto safe zone, but it's not protected by in the air. This is being targeted by the Air Force, the Assad Air Force, very easily. I mean, that's on the ground already you have. This is why it has to be protected by the safe zone, and also providing some heavy weapons for the Free Syrian Army to protect it, not allowing the Assad army to get in and inside. Much more worse, where the Assad army, they attacked the Syrian refugees inside Turkey. And the joke right now in Syria, they thought maybe Turkey, they need Free Syrian Army to defend themselves. It's because Turkey, they raise very high expectation. The Prime Minister Erdogan, he said, will not allow for another Hama, will not allow for the Hama massacre happened in Syria in 1982, where Hafez al-Assad, the father of the current president, killed more than 25,000. In February 1982, which this allowed him to hold the power more than 30 years, because he spread the fear among the country, and no one can raise up against. And this is why every time now the Syrians, they use that Hama rules, which became implemented by the Assad regime by doing the same practices these days. I think if the international community are serious, they can find different ways to intervene and to implement the necessary. Always, it's not an easy. It's not an easy. Even that, when the Syrian uprising started in March 2011 until September 2011, always they repeat that we have 4 pillars of the Syrian revolution. One of them rejection of any military intervention from outside, because they need to change the Assad by themselves. But at the end, they found out the Assad, he doesn't care about the people. He can commit more crimes, crimes against humanity, massacres. And this is why I feel that they have to ask the help from the international community to end the crisis and to end the massacres, which are ongoing every day.
I just got a question. You mentioned before that Syria, the fact that they're not very involved in the international scale, like in the UN or other international organizations, that made it hard for the West to, have pressure or have leverages on Syria. Well, then what about Libya? I mean, as far as many of us noticed, that they also were in the same place. They didn't have a lot of relations with the UN or international organizations. Yet, when Libya had the revolution, the UN and the Security Council just intervened very quickly, way faster than many people expected. Do you think it's maybe an economical reason, the fact that Libya has oil and it's important for the West, and Syria does not have oil, or maybe political, the fact that Syria is backed by maybe Iran? What do you think the reason is?
I'm not a great believer in the oil theory, in the US policy toward the region, but maybe this is one of the factors. It's because the international community acted very quickly on the crisis in Libya, in Kuwait, or when being invaded by Iraq, Saddam Hussein at that time. And we see that in other examples where the international community acted very slowly in areas like Bosnia and Kosovo, where became humanitarian disaster or humanitarian catastrophe. I think the international community always acted very slowly. Look what's happening in Rwanda on many areas. But when in the oil, where we have very close special interest, because in Libya, as example, 6% of the oil will go to Europe. With now the international or the world under very financial crisis, will not allow for another crisis because the prices of oil. And this is why the international community intervened and acted very quickly in Libya. But in Syria, they see it as this is a humanitarian disaster. Let the people, they die. Let the people will suffer. And we'll think later on if we have decided to intervene or not.
There have been a deliberate effort by the Syrian regime to label the opposition as fundamentalist or whatever.
Terrorists.
And they have been threatening, saying that if they win, they will persecute the minorities of Syria. What is the role of the Christians in Syria today and other Alawites? I'm sure that not all Alawites support the regime, and the Druze. Are they part of the opposition? Because the last bombing in Halab was targeted at the Christian neighborhoods, right? So there was an effort by the regime actually to basically scare off the Christians and tell them that if the Sunnis or whatever wins, you're going to be under, your rights will not be respected and so on. So what is the, in your view, the solution to this? Or?
First, I would like to comment about the word protection. Because always they said, the commentators or of pro the Assad, they said that it's protecting the minorities. Okay, killing 10,000 and protecting minorities. It's very interesting. That's how to deal with it. Second, the Syrian uprising, when it started, crossed the sects, crossed the ethnics, crossed the religion. This is why being Christian have been killed, Alawite have been killed, and Druze has been killed. Yesterday, the Assad regime shelled the Angelic Church in Homs. And they came, the Assad State TV, they came to tape and to make some videos for the state to say that this is armed terrorist group who shelled. And the Christian inhabitants in Homs, they rejected that and they crushed the whole group of the Syrian State TV. I have the story, it's a very telling story. I have a friend of mine who is a human rights activist. His name is Muhannad al-Hassani. He's been in prison in Syria since 2005 because he's been defending the political prisoners in Syria. And always inside Syria, when they jailed this human rights activists, they put them with the criminals, rapists, drug dealers, to punish them more as a way of humiliation, abuse them. And he was in prison along with the Christian worker, and he was a rapist and drug dealer. When the uprising started, the Assad regime gave many amnesties to release those criminals, to use them as a shabiha. And this guy, he knows that he will be released soon. And he came to my friend lawyer Muhannad and he asked him, how can I help the Syrian people? And Muhammad was joking, you have this criminal history and you need, and he was crying, I need to help. This is a way how the revolution in humanity changed the way how the Syrian they acted. He released in June. Then he died in Hama when he trying to enter some children milk to the children of Hama during the siege. He became one of the heroes of the Syrian uprising, and they raised their names in Hama and other areas. This is how under such a crisis, I think there is no any difference between being Christian or being Alawite or being Sunni. It's all became as Syrians, acted as a Syrian to protect and to provide the all necessary help, the all necessary assistance to your brothers.
I met this Christian family
Yeah.
And he's an older man. I was very surprised how touched they are and how pro the revolution they are. And I thought they would be scared. He said, no, this is our country. We want it back.
Exactly. And Syria has no history of any civil war. In 1952, the Prime Minister of Syria, his name Faris al-Khoury. Faris al-Khoury, he's a Protestant, and the majority of the Christians in Syria are Orthodox. He's minority of the minorities. Even that he became Prime Minister for 2 terms, and later on he became Speaker of the House. And at that time, the Muslim Brothers, they have 4 seats in the parliament, and they endorse him and support his position to be Prime Minister for 2 terms. Syria, we don't have any history of civil war, Christian, Muslim, even that we have Jews in Syria. We still have 76 Jews in Syria. They live and coexist with each other in peace. And this is something we have to be very careful, because the Assad regime, the Assad regime, trying to invest in the civil war, arming the Alawite community against the others.
They're like in Lebanon, I'm Lebanese. I mean, if anyone played the ethnic card and the religious card, it's the Syrians. They mastered that, and now they say, oh, no, we are here to protect. It's such a hypocrisy beyond anything I've ever heard.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, they turn the Lebanese on each other every single day.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yes. You said that Iran has a close relationship to Assad. Well, I was wondering, what is the stance of Saudi Arabia? What have they said about all this?
The Saudi Arabia, look, comments something on Iran. The Iran not backing the Assad regime, but they send the snipers to kill the Syrians. And every day we got information how yesterday we got a leaked document from the Ministry of Interior. He gave the orders to the officers club to host 32 Iranian trainers. What's the trainer they doing right now in Syria? To train, of course, the snipers and others. The Iranian, they help the Assad regime financially also. They give them the equipment to control the internet, all social media, all of that. Because the Syrians, because the isolation years, they are very stupid. It's the story, it's joke, but it's not joke. At the early days, the Facebook, the social media played a very important role, especially among the young and the youth. One of the checkpoints, they stopped one of the activists in his car, and they opened his bag, and they said, "Where's the Facebook?" They thought the Facebook is like a bag. This is the early days of the uprising. Later on, of course, they've been trained under the Iranian, and they get the very sophisticated equipment how to monitor and how to control all of that. Regarding the role of the Saudi Arabia, it's the Arab League, it was acted very slow. It's not like in Libya. We acted very quickly. Because they thought maybe the Assad will be able to make some reform, to enter some changes, etc., etc. And the Assad is different than al-Qaddafi at that time. With Qaddafi, no one is like him. And this decided to move very quickly against him. This is why the Arab League, they acted only on Ramadan in August 2011, where the images, it was very, very sad for the all public opinion, Arabic public opinion, to see that in front of the YouTubes, to see how the minorities has been attacked and been collapsed by the Assad tanks, how they enter in the mosques, how they kill the people, even that in Ramadan. And because in Ramadan decided to launch a huge campaign against in Hama and in Homs. That's where the first time from the Arab League decided to act, and they released first statement. But later on, now the situation is beyond the Arab League. Now it's the situation, still the Qatar and the Saudi Arabia and all the Gulf countries, Tunisia, Egypt, and many Arabic countries, maybe only Lebanon, which puts him تنأى بنفسها, which puts itself in a far away, like it's a neutral position toward what's the crisis in Syria. But all the Arab nations, especially the public, they are very supportive of the Syrian revolution.
Would you comment on the role of Turkey? You mentioned all neighboring countries, but Turkey has been so closely involved in helping Syria. I just wondered if you had a comment on that.
The Turkish government, as I said, they raised very high expectation that they help the Syrian opposition, they help the Syrian people. But with the same time, they came up to the reality they cannot intervene militarily alone without the coverage from the Arab League or from the Security Council, because they will be seen as a foreign occupation country, and back to the stories of the Ottoman Empire and all of that. This is why they're very cooperative with the Arab League, with the Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and with the United States to do and to coordinate all the actions. And I think now Turkey, it's concluded that the only language that the Assad will understand is using the force. We don't need to give him more time to kill more Syrians. We have to use the force. This is the only way can the Assad understand.
You mentioned earlier that you didn't think that China and Russia had strategic goals in the region. I would maybe encourage a slight re-examination of that. China has some of the biggest oil contracts with Iran, and Russia is one of the biggest arms dealers, along with the U.S. and others. Jordan has one of the biggest arms conferences. So maybe they're taking a more pronounced role on some of their strategic, because it may be more of a balance, and actually I've looked for some comments on this, on active strategic versus indirect strategic competition, and maybe that's why it's playing out the way it is.
But Iran imports to China 7% of its oil, Saudi Arabia 32%. It's not an issue of strategic interest in the economic side. But there is, of course, explanation. I've been in Russia twice, and the last time in December, where we met the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Lavrov. They think they've been bluffed in Libya because they agreed on the resolution 1973 to protect the civilians, but that ended up to be regime change. And they don't want to allow that to be happening again in Syria. They don't care, of course, about the human rights violations, all these crimes against humanity. For them, it's about their prestige and about their position. And how can they play that? And of course, the Assad regime benefit from that, because the Gaddafi played on that. If you recall that al-Gaddafi brought many CEOs from Russia and gave them $3 billion contracts, but that did not change the Russian position and toward the Security Council. Now they don't have a very short economic interest, but they see this is now the venue for them to challenge the United States and the West at the Security Council. And they know the United States, they cannot do more these days. They cannot move beyond the Security Council. The United States now, for domestic reasons here. And this is why the Russians been acted or overacted in Syria in a way how there was many tries from the Arab League to change the Russian position, but been changed very slightly on the last resolution. But I don't think that the end will vote to resolution under Charter 7.
For
the regime falls, what will be the role of the Syrian National Council?
It's the Syrian National Council. It's a transitional government. Will play a role, hopefully, after the fall of the Assad regime until the first free and fair elections will be held in the country. Because as we see in that the constitution has to be changed, the law of the political parties has to be changed, the law of the election has to be changed. All these laws has to be changed. And this should be a transition government to be responsible in all of that. But one of the major challenges, how can restrain the power, restrain the authority on the streets, especially after the Shabiha or the militias, those talking also who's taking arms. This is one of the challenges and responsibility. And we see right now that Libyan Transitional Council, how it's very difficult to control on all of these militias and to bring the stability. The demilitarization process is not an easy, and you need to have resources, you need to have the long-term negotiations, and you have to have the support from the people and from the international community.
What do you see for the future of Syria in 3 months, 6 months, and a year or two?
I see hope. I see, of course, that because something always, every time, I'm proud of the Syrian people. After 14 months and systematic and widespread killings, you will see protests every day. Last Friday, it was more than 2 million on the streets, protesting in different cities in Syria. This is remarkable courage, which everyone, they know when he go to demonstrating, he will be killed. There is no other option. And despite all of that, they are demonstrating because, and maybe the Syrians, they know that how much freedom is expensive. But they are protesting, and I think that, as we see here, the freedom is not free. We test that right now.
How long will it continue?
This is 1 million question. I don't think that depends on of course, the Syrians will not accept the Assad to stay in power. This is very clear. Will not accept a negotiation with him or any dialogue with him. The Assad has to move and to hold accountable. But when that will, as President Obama said, it's a question of when, not question of if. The Assad will fall for sure, but then that's a question maybe that to the international community, because there is no great responsibility of the international community in these days to help the Syrians.
Last week, Andy Carvin spoke here concerning citizen journalism, anti-Arab Spring, and according to my notes, at one point he was asked about the situation with Syria and why or how would the citizen journalism play in. His comments were that, and I'd like you to just respond your perspective. He said that in the middle, that Syria got caught in the middle of other revolutions, and that the government was clever in limiting the amounts of killing at any given time. He said that it was not in a position to use social media because it was being shut down, at least not to the extent of, say, in some other countries, and that because the government shut down the internet and targeted the people who use video. That's his perspective as an outsider. What's your perspective?
I disagree. Because the social media has been used in different countries in different ways. Of course, the Facebook, as example, in Tunisia, because 20% of the population in Tunisia has their Facebook account. The Facebook played an important role in mobilizing the people. They set up the time, they set up the date, and they set up the place to go to demonstration. But it wasn't the same case in Syria. if we call the Syrian or the Egyptian revolution as the Facebook revolution, the Syrian one is the YouTube revolution. The YouTube in Syria became the only source to document the human rights violations. And I spoke before that about the Hama rules. What's the difference between Hama and right now? This is the iPhone. Before that, we don't have any photos, any documentations about what's going on, what's happening in the country. Right now, in every minute, we got the photos and the pictures. That's, of course, help the people to empower them to continue their demonstration, to continue their courage and to their struggle. With the same time, help us as human rights observers and as politicians to get all these images, these documentations, to go to the International Criminal Court or other human rights organization. We got details. There's on the net more than 30,000 YouTube videos about the human rights violations in Syria. This is a huge number, and this is, as we said, this is the much documented revolution on history, because many people being died just because they're making YouTubes or videos. And yesterday, 2 days ago, there's someone from Hama, and we heard his voice, how he was taking the pictures of one of the tanks. He's shooting his home. Then the YouTube, his phone being taken by his sister and synced to the outside, and we saw the video. And this is the way that the social media, especially the YouTube, played an important role in the documentation all. Look to the CNN or Al Jazeera or BBC. All they depends on the YouTube, because the Assad regime did not allow for any journalist, and they kicked out all the journalists outside of the country. Look what's happened for the 5 journalists in Bab Amr in Homs. One of them, of course, Colvin. She lost one of her eyes in